Bengal, India, 1943. Nearly 4 million people are starving to death, but not from lack of rain or harvest. Instead, this apocalypse is the result of colonial racism, draconian war measures, and outright head-in-the-sand incompetence. And a huge amount of the blame can be placed at the feet of this fat piece of shit.
Indians are a beastly people with a beastly religion. They breed like rabbits.
By April of 1942, Burma had fallen to the Japanese. Allied forces had retreated, and a wave of refugees flooded neighboring Bengal. Beginning in March, the British began a brutal, scorched earth campaign in Bengal in order to deny the Japanese any provisions should they continue to penetrate into India. This heartless and murderous strategy was twofold. First, there was the denial of rice policy, which, as the name suggests, meant the removal of surplus rice from the area, so it could not ever be used to feed the Japanese. But not only did this greatly reduce the amount of food left for the people in Bengal, but it also produced something even more insipid. It disastrously interrupted a deeply interwoven tradition of trust and credit, so the flow of rice as trade began to evaporate. The second prong in this tyrannical British war campaign was the boat denial policy. Meant to deny the Japanese any means of transportation within Bengal, it mainly involved confiscation and destruction of local boats. Some 45,000 civilian boats were confiscated or even destroyed. This squashed all forms of river trade movement, food shipping, and livelihood. The fishing economy was completely broken. Hundreds of thousands became destitute. These measures were so goddamn draconian, the Indian National Parliament, among many other groups, severely denounced them. This was the start of a great movement in India that would eventually see the end of British rule forever. I'm guessing that you can already tell that if there ever was a case of the cure being even worse than the disease, this would be it. One could be forgiven for wondering if the people of Bengal would have been much better off if the Japanese were just allowed to invade. Yeah, they would have committed the odd massacre here and there, knowing them, but at least millions would have had some access to food and livelihood. Well, I'm not even done listing all the ways British rule contributed to this little-known Holocaust. In mid-1942, the Bengal Chamber of Commerce, composed mainly of, yeah, you guessed it, rich British landowners, came up with yet another brilliantly heartless idea. They would prioritize the distribution of food to workers in factories related to the war effort, which meant rice was redirected from starving rural areas to city centers, especially the industrial area around Calcutta. With vast areas of India's countryside being denied any state-sponsored distribution, Churchill's war cabinet still had to go one step further in this genocide by denial. Not only did they reject all requests for food to be shipped to India, but also the colony was not allowed to use its own money reserves or even its own ships to import any food relief at all.
This is one of the greatest disasters that have ever befallen any people under British rule. And the damage to our reputation among Indians and foreigners in India is incalculable.
Those were the words spoken by the Viceroy of India, and they apparently fell upon deaf ears. It would indeed be Churchill's bigotry that would decide where famine would take place in India. The fact remains that the War Cabinet's shipping assignment for August of 1943 saw wheat from Australia shipped to South Africa, the Middle East, just about anywhere except India. And don't give me any of that concern over enemy U-boat crap. Because why were shipments still being made to South Africa and the Middle East? Then Britain turned the thumbscrews on India's economy, forcing them into a credit system that created large-scale money inflation. And around that time, massive military buildup displaced many poor Bengalis. Many farmers were driven off their land to construct airstrips and camps for the British and American military. An estimated 30 to 36,000 families were driven off their homes and fields. No surprise that they would soon become victims of the famine. By mid-1943, it was obvious to everybody that a major humanitarian disaster was taking place. Tens of thousands of orphans were being left by the street. The lucky ones were sold into prostitution or purchased as household servant slaves. All the while, shipments of rice were still leaving India. This is not rocket science. If you have starving people back home, you keep the food at home. To not mince words, food was being extorted by the British. But Churchill still brushed off any notion that there was a famine in India. He asked out loud in public that if so many people were dying in India, why was Gandhi still alive? In December of 1942, a Japanese air raid forced millions to flee Calcutta. To ensure that prioritized military production workers were still fed, the government seized rice stocks from wholesale dealers. This completely undermined any trust between dealers and the government. Even medical care was redirected to priority groups, the military factory workers. It was almost as if the British government was marking undesirables for death. The provinces all throughout India began to hoard their rice, not even allowing it to be exported locally. They feared what happened in Bengal would also happen to them, so they guarded their rice reserves frantically. Add to that speculators trying to make a quick buck, and what you had was runaway inflation in the rice market. The bodies were piling up. There were just too many of them to dispose of, and a sanitation crisis compounded any efforts for relief. But thankfully, from many diverse regions, communists, socialists, wealthy merchants, women's groups, private citizens from distant Karachi, and even Indian expatriates from as far off as South Africa stepped in to fill in the void left behind by the monstrous British machinery. They did all they could, but it still wasn't nearly enough. It wasn't until April of 1944 when global condemnation of his lack of response to the crisis reached a fever pitch that Churchill finally asked the US of A for some help in shipping grain to India. But the US claimed that they just couldn't spare the ships. Those who would still say that Churchill did all he could for the famine. Well, I must remind them that for 2 fucking years, from 1942 till 1944, Churchill kept refusing his own viceroy in India any supplies of grain or relief. All this genocidal mismanagement and bigotry led to civil unrest in India. In fact, it sowed the very first seeds of what would become India's independence after the war. Part of Churchill's disdain for India is that he knew full well that it could not be ruled by Britannia for much longer. Now to recap. In the past 100 years, before 1943, India was struck by no less than 8 famines, but the Bengal Famine was the only one to not be caused by natural disasters. This was a completely man-made humanitarian disaster, the scientific word for it being anthropogenic. May I reiterate that perhaps millions of lives would have been saved if the Japanese had taken over India. And I'm happy to say that in the 75 years since India's independence, there has not been a single major famine. So much for the benefits of British rule.